Very excited to have you here today for the webinar. Steve Richard here with Steve Robinson across the pond. I know he went to Cambridge, but I wore my Oxford Turf Tavern shirt today just to mess with him a little bit. But let me give you a little background on Steve. Very happy to be here talking about the topic of selling with value and value cases. So Steve is the CEO of Sales Engine. He's been doing this for 30 years, a rare man that I get to see that has slightly more gray hairs than me, which is great. So private and public sector companies in Europe and the States. And he's also very passionate about sales performance, driving it through underlying the structures, the approaches. And in particular, I think, Steve, your I'd say superpower is asking really good questions, getting sales professionals to ask those really good questions that so often perhaps we don't see them asking as much. So Steve, welcome.
Brilliant. Lovely to be here. Thank you, Steve. Superpower worries me slightly. I'll say obsession and passion rather than superpower. How about that?
I think that's fine. I think that's fine. I get to speak for you though on that one. So I know you're going to be very modest. So I'm going to go ahead and begin here and share the slides and just confirming if you can tell me, do you see my slides? Is it coming through loud and clear on your side? All right, because our friends at Microsoft,
that's good.
It's very good. Our friends at Microsoft continue to have releases. This time it seems like their Copilot release is messing with my machine. Got to figure that one out later on. So as we're going through this, everyone, I would like it if you could please to use the chat. This is going to be recorded for later on. You'll have an opportunity to get the slides and the recording. People are always asking about that to share with anybody who wasn't here. And we're going to be asking a lot of questions of you, but we also want you asking questions of us and making it so it's kind of a dialogue here. So please do be using the chat as we go along or the Q&A. And Will, who's off camera, is going to be monitoring those. I'll peek at them periodically and make sure that we make this as interactive as we possibly can. So the first thing I'd like to ask here, Steve, before we get into where you're gonna pick up, is I would be curious, and Will, if you could open up this poll here for those of you who are attending. Does your sales process have value selling or value realization built into it? And what I mean by this is there a requirement at any point in time to build a business case? Is it a stage gate? I see for some organizations, they actually have an opportunity or a deal size where some of our customers, it's like greater than 75K. There is an actual requirement that there must be a business case that was created, a value case of some sort. Could be from a value engineering team, could be from an individual contributor rep. Steve, what do you see out there as it relates to this?
So I think very much lots of different approaches from various customers. So yeah, we see all the different stages. People who are just beginning the journey, people who've got it really embedded, got teams really up and running. But yeah, there's no consistent pattern at the moment. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of variation out there for sure.
And I think most companies, if you say, are you guys going to try to have ROI as part of your approach? Most are going to say yes. If you go to those same people and say, what's the degree of sophistication with which you can try to model the ROI specific to that customer in a believable way that their CFO will go, yes, I'd say that's where we start to have people fall off. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think intent to do it is probably much stronger than reality of delivery, maybe.
I think that's right. And this is kind of sets us up beautifully, because if this poll had showed up differently, Steve, the talk track we had planned really wouldn't have worked at all. But I'm hoping everybody can see this. Are you seeing this on your screen?
Mm-hmm.
So the vast majority, yes, but there's no way to capture the value case, or yes, and there is a way to do it in a specific point of time, but not threaded into every customer touch point. So this is, I think, a good way for us to start the conversation. Can you talk to me a little bit about Curates egg? This one, when you and I were prepping, I was like leaning into this big time. So talk to me.
So Curates egg, this is, leaning in is a great expression, because here I'm very much leaning into probably a very British phrase and quite a British stereotype. And the story of the Curates egg actually goes back to it was a cartoon in 1895 in an old British magazine, and a curate is a member of the clergy, a man of the cloth. and the story or the cartoon was all about this curate being served an egg that was bad. And he did what for me felt like a really British thing, which was when he was asked if his egg was okay, he actually said, well, yes, it's good in parts. So rather than be rude about it, he was actually quite, he was trying to be as polite as possible. And so for me, this became a British expression where when we're trying to not overly criticize, but point out there are flaws in things, what we say is it's a bit of a curate's egg. Things are good in part. And actually, for me, this is where I think selling is at the moment. And it's the reason that I wanted to introduce this as a concept is I think we are at a curate's egg phase. I think we are good in parts at selling. I think there are bits that we're getting right, but there's an awful lot at the moment, I think, particularly with the pace of change, there's loads of improvement we can still make. So I'm being very British. I'm not criticizing. I'm just basically trying to share that, yeah, there's more we can do.
I'm gonna be American on this one, all right? And I'm gonna say that it all changed in 2022. Prior to that, I know there was the kind of concept of we all sell to the CFO or we all sell to the economic buyer. And prior to that, you weren't necessarily competing for the same resources. Yes, you were ultimately having to get their stamp of approval, but the stamps of approval were a little bit more liberal. They were more generous. They were going out more frequently. And then of course, after January of 2022, everything started to change. You start to see the corporate governance kick back in, and the bar for what's expected of those business cases is higher here, is higher. So yeah. I think that's where we could say it's an opportunity for us to continue to get better. Maybe it's not that what was it? The thing about not all the egg is bad.
Yeah, it's good in parts. That's good what it is.
Good in parts. So let's jump from that and let's have a conversation about where is the state right now. And actually, I'm going to ask all of you. Let's do another poll. Will, I did see a note about poor sound. So if any of you are having challenges with someone's sound, just put it in the chat. If it's Steve Richard, my sound, if it's Steve Robinson, who you're having trouble hearing, just put in the chat. We'll try to fix it here right now while we're doing this poll. So here's my question for you. Next poll, if you would, please, Will, is what's your maturity level for using business cases with your buyers? What's your maturity level? No value-based selling model at this point. Reps are selling on features, which, look, the truth is this is probably a lot more prevalent than any of us will care to admit. And at the same time, you're probably not going to select it, but who knows? Value fire drills. This is where those business cases are being built ad hoc by reps and managers. And then finally, if you have some sort of a centralized approach with interactive software-based value solutions that are managed centrally. Usually what you'll see is when people get to that second level of maturity, they start to use a lot of spreadsheets. And initially, that's a heck of a lot better than the fire drills where everything's everywhere. But then ultimately, it's hard to scale the spreadsheets, and it's difficult for sellers to use or follow complicated spreadsheets with macros and formulas. And let's be honest with ourselves, most sellers didn't excel at math. That's probably not why they're in sales.
So just to test, I've just swapped to a microphone. So I just want to make sure that hopefully this fixes that, Steve.
Crystal clear for me. So Phil, hopefully that's good for you and everybody else who had mentioned it. So value fire drills, 59% of people are saying, hey, it's a little bit ad hoc. Maybe there's some centralization with a spreadsheet, but we're certainly not at any point where we have any kind of software. Any thoughts on this here, Steve?
I think what really stands out here, it's really interesting that 14% still actually have no value-based selling model at all. And I think given how competitive things are out there, given how tough the market is, it's really interesting that, that people just not baking this in on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, it shows we've got a lot of work to do still.
And I'll throw this out there. There are going to be some sales models. For example, I talked to a company the other day that has it's a well-known brand name. They have a product-led growth technology business. They don't really have a whole lot of peers in the market. It's more or less a monopoly, and they are in an accelerated growth stage with inbound. Do they really need to use business cases now if they're selling SMB? Probably not. what happens over time, though, is they tend to go up market, they tend to go enterprise. And do you eventually have to have, business value assessments as part of that reality to go up market and to do that effectively? Yes. And that's exactly where they are as a business. They're kind of at this inflection point where now it used to be like hey, sure, if we do it, great. But if we don't, it doesn't really impact our win rate that much. And all of a sudden now it's like, if we don't have this, we're going to be in trouble because we can't close $500,000 deals with big enterprise or strategic accounts where historically we've been really good at the 50K types.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. So, Steve, yeah, talk a little bit about, the first one I think is very good. You put the understanding the needs of the customer.
Yeah, so I wanted to discuss this because I think the value selling, the idea of building a business case, it's beyond question now that people need to do it. But the thing that I find interesting is that I think what's actually happening at the moment is salespeople have got very good at questioning to establish need in order to position a product or a solution. And I think as buying complexity has increased, as the number of stakeholders in a deal has increased, what I'm seeing as a gap at the moment, and it's why I think here we're looking at 3 pivotal moments where I think sales can improve. I think the first of these is really fascinating because I think sales need to get better at the big picture questioning. I think they need to get better at understanding or questioning and getting into the understanding of customer outcomes. So when we get involved with organizations, we do see that they know how to sell their product at a point solution sort of moment in time. But we can't get into building an ROI. We can't get into building a business case and really establishing the value if we don't know the story that the customer needs us to be telling. If we don't know that big picture of, where is that company going? What's the direction? What's the vision? What's the mission? Our product, service, solution, whatever it may be, how are we contributing to that big picture? So for me, that's why I just wanted to call out this first piece, because I think before we dive into the whole building an ROI and building a business case, you've got to understand that organization in detail. And I think there's now some great opportunities for sellers to just get deeper research easier than, we've never had it so good in terms of background research into an organization before meetings, for example, just harnessing AI in order to be able to really understand. For me, the classic one is an annual report. If we're trying to work out where is an organization going, yes, you can read 55 pages of an annual report, or you can use AI to summarize it to give you that jump off point with the customer. So I guess I wanted to just raise this first point about, are sellers consistently really seeing the big picture that they can connect their business case to, or are they just diving straight down into the weeds and down into the product itself? That's sort of, for me, what I just wanted to pose as a thought more than anything else.
Yeah. So Steve, I'm gonna ask a question that I'm gonna butcher your name, but it's either Leveka or Levika had asked in here in a second. But I want to just, in an interest of concrete takeaways, something that Steve said there I think is very important. I don't want it to be lost, which is the amount of information we have with generative AI. I'm going to throw a little shout out there for example, like everyone knows ChatGPT. But my clients that are using solutions like Claude, which is now owned by Amazon, or Perplexity, are having quite good results. They tend to be a little bit better for business focused sort of questions, as opposed to like ChatGPT helps my kids do their homework. So, because sometimes my kids are like, my 14-year-old's like, Dad, do you remember how to do this kind of derivative? I'm like, nope.
Yeah, as if, yeah.
Get on that second computer and go ask ChatGPT to teach you. But I just want to throw that out there. But Leveka said, please break down how to illustrate value of a product and solution. And I want to throw that to you, Steve, because it tied to what you were talking about. Get your take on that.
Yes, it's a great question. I think in terms of establishing the value, I always see things almost in layers as a seller. I think it's about, if you can find that top level goal or the top level outcome, you can then begin to unpack the layers underneath that. So let's say, for example, an organization is trying to drive productivity and efficiency. as the overarching goal. So for me, that's nice to know. It's good to understand, but let's start putting some metrics against it. Let's start to understand how much do they need to improve productivity by, and for what reasons and for what outcomes. But as a seller, then we can start to unpack where are the opportunities to drive that productivity and efficiency. So for me, I've been a big fan since 2013 of the challenger sale model. I think that really did a lovely sort of idea of, because buyers now are so far through their thought process when they engage with us, if we're starting to unpack this value piece, it's actually about saying, okay, well, you've probably already thought about how you're going to drive efficiency and improvements in productivity. So tell us, where are you focused? Why are you focused in those areas? And how are you calculating the problems and the value there? Because once we've then established that layer, I want to go the layer below that, say, okay, so what are the specifics that are either stopping you, or what are the specifics that open up the opportunities? And this, for me, is how sellers establish value in these early meetings, by incessant questioning more than anything else. And you kind of mentioned this in the introduction about, this is where my passion is it's insatiable curiosity as a seller. That's what I think you've got to have. That's how you can establish the value, by driving through all of these elements, really understanding the process, and then pulling that apart into the sort of, to build the business case. And I know that's more your piece, Steve, in terms of the sort of the individual elements of building the business case. I'll let you speak to that. But if you haven't got those initial layers first, I think your business case is built on sand ultimately. So I'm all about establishing that first piece. And then I think what I'm curious to know from you is how you then begin to kind of break that apart at a much more mathematical capture level.
This is exactly what, again, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, Lavecca is saying in here about, like, okay, if we're talking about a point solution, if you look at how a salesperson will try to generate some sort of ROI or total cost of ownership understanding for a point solution, it's fairly simplistic. You know what I mean? It's really, it's math that most people can do, but it's not getting to, is the way you're positioning it here, an ultimate solution. And the ultimate solution is probably going to be a combination of several point solutions along the way, or several point products along the way, and potentially even some things that you don't do as a company that has to be calculated into and woven into that overall story. So being able to create that narrative. And it's interesting you bring up, like, of course, at Mediafly, we help build business cases. But if you look at what the best ones of our customers are doing, they typically have a product portfolio. They typically have different ways of combining that product portfolio based on either industry vertical or market segment, or some combination of those, or even geography. And that ultimately creates a value story. Now, the value story has to have this quantitative element where you can model in those different components. So, for example, Steve, you mentioned, what sort of constraints might exist out there. So a lot of customers for their individual situation, if you're trying to ask those deep, powerful, important questions, if they're building a business case, they're kind of on the same side of the table with you, then they have to be honest with, like, my CFO is going to call BS on this. And if we can model the constraints into the value case for that customer within their BVA, then the CFO is going to look at that and go, well, you didn't actually take into account resource availability. You did, in fact, take into account the change management processes and how that's a little bit tougher in APAC than it is in North America, for example. So you can mathematically model that in. However, to your point, if you're not doing that by first asking those questions to understand the needs of the customer, and if you're not ultimately weaving that into a story so that it's a value story, the business case on its own as an ROI calculation usually goes in the rubbish bin, I mean, so I'm curious to get your thoughts on all that I just said.
I agree. And I think it's the assumptions that kill you in a deal. So when you start looking at, and again, if I just think about the things that drive me crazy when I see it in sales processes, but it's the assumptive numbers that people put forward in business cases. So they'll capture some elements of, this is what it's costing you today, this is how many people, this is your cost per person, and so on. But always, it seems to me to be, it's the improvement number that is the made up number. It's almost like, okay, well, if we can establish that the costs are $800,000 of the current process, the business case becomes hinged on, so our software will improve that by 20%. So there's your business case. And it's like, well, hang on, where did that 20% come from? Where's my evidence? And to your point about CFOs, I think this is why they punch holes in business cases all the time, is yes, even if you've captured the costs correctly, what gives me any confidence that the improvement number being put forward can actually be delivered? And the classic thing is people saying, okay, so we're going to save this much manpower, which equates to this much cost saving. It's like, well, does it? Because if we're still paying those people, that's not actual measurable cost. So again, this for me comes back to that needs of the customer. Great questioning to establish, well, if we save these people time, what are they going to do with that time? Because if they're going to go home early, well, that's not measurable impact that a CFO is going to actually pay for. If we're avoiding additional recruitment spend, then yes, we've got a business case. And for me, that's the really fascinating interplay now here, is trying to move away from these assumptive numbers. And again, I think we've made progress. I think sellers are asking more questions of the customer for their numbers. I think we see less pure ROI calculators where the seller fills it out and comes up with an amazing payback. So I think customers are getting used to inputting in. We've now just got to get better at how do we prove it? How do we demonstrate the value in an unarguable way rather than a sort of made up percentage improvement number?
I have there are a couple of points in here and some questions. I'm going to come to all of your questions in here in a second. Gary, you had asked about, can you show specifically how to use different KPIs to illustrate ROI in a business case example? The answer is, in the interest of making this more topical and less about software, we did not kind of prep a specific demo of MediaFly's technology in use for using different KPI inputs. Happy to do that with you one off. Let's have that conversation, and we can show you dozens of examples and find one that meets your needs. The next question, David's question, I'm gonna tee up with a poll. So Will, if you could please pull up the one about who owns the business cases, building the business cases. Now, because I think this is at a very, very important point. The ownership of business cases in a company, from what I've seen, and also the amount of support that's provided by the CRO and other sales leaders, revenue leaders in the company, CMO as well, from what I've observed, dictates whether or not it becomes an organizational priority or whether or not it just kind of is a flavor of the week. People tune out, adoption rates 10% type of thing. So who owns building business cases? Value engineering, reps, managers, product marketing, or somebody else? We've especially seen some top of funnel value tools where product marketing owns it, or sometimes they actually own the BVAs, which seems odd to me. But in the absence of having another functional area to own it, it ends up being them. It could probably include sales or rev ops. Some of you probably have them. And there you have it, 20% value engineering, the reps and managers, 64%, and then a little bit of product marketing and other. Okay.
Yeah. And it's interesting to see that it is still sitting with the reps and managers, and there's quite a skill to building a business case. There's complexity that sits behind it. And I'm loving the rise of the value team within organizations. I can think of a couple of our customers now who have invested in actual proper experts to own this and sit alongside sales. And let's face it, sellers have so much on their plate these days to try to make, to shape and get a deal over the line. that actually just having somebody who is really good at these core calculations, this core way of working and documenting it and linking it to the wider business. I'm loving the increase in the value selling team. I think it's a great opportunity to just do more in this area and help sellers out. So it's not always sales's problem.
And so now I'm going to go to what David put into the chat here, where he said, okay, look, preaching to the converted, maybe it's fair to say there's a category of clients or prospects that are going to be really receptive to value selling approach. And then another one that's going to be more transactional, process driven types of salespeople, that type of a revenue function where it will not necessarily work. What's your experience on that when you're dealing with those more transactional process driven sales teams? Maybe they'll be more quote metrics focused because it's like they're doing the volume game thing.
Oh, it's a risky assumption, I guess, would be my take on it, because I think at a transactional level, the problem is you don't have the time as a seller, and you don't want your sellers to spend that long on the individual deals, because you have to get them done and get them out the door. But every deal has to be value focused. Every deal has to have an ROI against it anyway. So
hold on, actually, I read it wrong. And Ian, thanks for the clarification. He said, I think David means the customer and not the salesperson. In other words, when you're talking to a customer, when you're talking to a prospect, and if that prospect is like, they want to buy in a transactional sort of a way, they want to buy, you know what I mean? They're looking for transactional. They're doing the classic thing where, they're over here with their evaluation criteria. They're not going to tell you, David, I think I got that right. I think that's what you're going for. Like when you're dealing with that sort of that buyer archetype, how do you handle it? I mean, because that's not ultimately going to do good for them. It's not going to help their business or their, the rest of their stakeholders. What do you do?
Yeah, and I think it's probably a case by case basis in terms of your own product suite, your own product set, and how you're trying to sell. But there's a really lovely model. There's a sort of a value pyramid model, which has transactional selling at the bottom. I'm trying to remember it straight off the top of my head, but it's transactional goes to functional selling, where you're beginning to sell benefits, moving to consultative selling, and at the top you've got strategic, where strategic relationship is where a customer buys from you. You're never really having to sell. But it's quite a nice model to always have in mind as a seller, because if you're being forced into that transactional model all the time, then you've got to look at cost to serve as an organization. You've got to find a way to take that customer base and serve it in the most cost effective way possible, with a view then to your sellers trying to drive the right customers up that value pyramid as much as you possibly can. So it depends on product or service, but we should always be trying to get away from those transactional deals, because it's always going to be hard to make money there. Because if they're buying transactionally, even if you get the deal now, they're going to buy transactionally and buy somebody else next time. So it's not great business.
I'm going to throw this out there too. I mean, this is where there is a lot of art in selling too. If you're dealing with that type of person, I've dealt with that before. By the way, this is not going to work all the time, but at least it'll work a percentage of the time, a third. If you say to them, hey, look, I understand that you have your inputs, your evaluation criteria, and I understand you don't want to engage in this process. At the same time, all of these other customers, list 3 that are in their industry vertical, when we initially had these conversations, they engaged in this with us because they had to generate a quantitative business impact with their purchase decision. So I'm happy to provide whatever you need from me, Mr. and Mrs. Procurement. Here you go. And at the same time, we need to have a conversation with the business so that we can ultimately create something that we implement it will produce concrete return for your organization. Can we have that conversation? It's going to be better for everybody involved. If ultimately they say no, there's not a lot you can do. You're either at that point kind of going around them, or you're being forced into a transactional box, even though it's not good for them. It's not good for them. Yeah.
But I think as a seller, if you look at your portfolio of customers, and again, thinking of from a sales leader point of view, making sure all your sellers are doing this, of understanding when you're engaging with an organization, where do they sit within the portfolio? So, what is the value of the relationship and what is the value of that customer to you? So, do I really want to be trying to convert a transactional customer into a strategic? Because all the time that takes me could pull me away from actually just looking after guys who are ready to be really strategic with me. So if you again, it's a lovely McKinsey 4-box model, but making sure you know when you're talking to a customer, where do they sit in my portfolio? And therefore, is this transactional behavior a problem? Or actually, is this just what I expect from where they sit? And again, maybe sellers don't have enough clarity over their entire portfolio all the time to make those decisions.
And oh, by the way, we all know this. If you're responding to an RFP that your competitors wrote, don't spend a whole lot of time doing it. Okay. I mean, I think we all got that.
100%. Yeah.
Keith threw in a great stat that others have probably read. And as of Q3 2024, the win rate with a value consultant attached to an opportunity is 2.5 times higher than deals with a value assessment, but without. So if you got the value consultant with a value assessment versus deals without, you're 2.5 times higher in the win rate. And by the way, I've been seeing that fairly consistently with our customers here at MediaFly when we have the value engineering teams. And it's a shame because I think what's happening is I do see a lot of these people getting riffed. I see a lot of reduction of force, and a lot of times people look at enablement, they look at the value engineers, because realistically, these are smart people. They're usually well compensated, and it's kind of an easy line item. This is why it's even more important to have your value cases connected to your opportunities so you can present that case for here's with the assessment, here's without the assessment, here's with the involvement of the value engineering team or the business value consulting team, here's without the involvement of those people. To Steve's point, salespeople doing that on their own, some of them are going to get it. My experience is maybe a quarter of them can pull it off on their own, maybe 15 to 20%, something like that. The vast majority, like I mentioned before, if you look at the background of the value engineers, a lot of them like literally worked in like nuclear submarines in the Navy, and then and they were physics majors. And if you look at the backgrounds of the salespeople, they kind of look like me. You know what I mean? So I shouldn't be doing my own value cases either. So.
But just take a step back a second. 2.5 times improvement. Find me another area within sales where you could make that sort of difference. I think we've optimized so much these days that I'm not sure there's many things now that can really drive that much change. That's huge if true.
And Steve, this is one of the things that personally drives me nuts, because I look at the priorities. I talk to a lot of CRO, CSO, chief commercial officer types about their priority lists, and they always have their top 3 to 5. And this is usually one of them. But if you also have, a 1A, 1B, 1C, people are not going to prioritize this. The ones where I see that get that kind of result, it's because they have the leadership on down is all aligned that this is absolutely the number one priority. And then the next closest priority is priority 3. We have to commit to this organizationally that we're going to be using these sort of value cases in, very good. So one other thing that I came up here and I wanted to double back to it was, Levecka said again, is it measured by, or relayed by scale, impact, reach, or cost savings? What is the it, Levecka, in the is it measured or relayed by scale, impact, reach, and cost savings? And I think I know where you're going, but one of the interesting things we see is that each individual customer of ours at MediaFly is a little different with how they're structuring their business value assessments. Some of them in their marketplace with their competitiveness, that the total cost of ownership tells the story, and they can go right there. Other of them can have an ROI and a point solution. It's possible to do that. Other of them look at more of the benefit scope along the way, and the benefit scope can include soft benefit scope as well as a hard ROI calculation. So there's lots of different ways to do that, but I don't know if that was what your question was.
But I think, and that question probably goes to the third point that's on this slide as well, Steve, which is It's about, you can build the business case, you can establish that value, but salespeople have to be storytellers around that these days as well. And I think in terms of which metric and how we explain it, that's the actual art of the sales process right now. I think that's what we need from sellers is, how do we take this and turn it into a story that whoever this lands within the organization can get it, read it, understand it, and say yes to it. And again, in terms of things that I'm obsessed about, it's presentations, it's proposals, it's the encapsulation of that story into something that, you know, as a seller, the minute you submit a proposal into an organization, we lose control of it. That's the issue that we have. And I'm being slightly provocative in this slide, but I think what's happening in the market is, as a seller, I think we take ourselves really sort of, we're really careful with how we come across. You know, we prep, we really think about it. I think we try and be the Bentley. But then when we get into presentation phases, do you know what? I think it's a bit more ordinary. I think there's a lot of slides out there, and I'm not being rude about BMWs here, but they do the job. They're great. They're fine, but they're not a Bentley. And it's the bit that then really hits home is when you see the end proposal that gets submitted. That's where there's massive drop off in quality. And it's really fascinating for me that we've put all this love and care and attention into this organization. Yeah, we could have spent months, maybe even years nurturing this deal. The proposal should be that culmination. It should be the best thing you do as a seller. And actually, what I see out there is a lot of bland Word documents. I see a lot of reused content that doesn't really connect to the organization. You know, people find and replace names. And it's like, well, hang on, if we're trying to build this value case, if we're trying to value sell, if we're trying to really prove the ROI, the proposal has to be amazing. And if you put 3 months work into it, have no regrets. When you send that document in, you should be, you know, pressing the button, you should be sending the email, however you send it, thinking that'll work. Don't care who picks it up, don't care who reads it. We've just made an amazing case for ourselves. And I guess that's how I would kind of challenge people out there a little bit, is take a look at, you know, what your sellers are sending and just see whether it does survive that test. Are you really living up to, you know, the quality that you probably started out with at the start of the engagement?
Keith, I was laughing. He said, I learned to drive a Mini just like that, only it was in horse.
Fair play, absolutely.
Will, if you could please, last and final poll, do your presentations and proposals consistently include a basic ROI calculation, dynamic calculations based on bespoke quantitative inputs, all the above, plus that qualitative value story?
And just quickly, because I just saw a question flash up about ways of sort of, or things we could point people towards around storytelling. One good book that's always worth a look. So thinking about presentations more than proposals, to be fair, but there's a book called The Presentation Lab, written by a guy called Simon Morton. And I'll confess some bias here because I've known Simon for about 30 years now. But he's written a really good book on presentations that talks about structuring presentations, storytelling, and just how to worry less about the slides and more about the story. So hopefully that's a useful guide to kind of point somebody to. But yeah, there's lots of stuff out there, but the Presentation Lab's a really nice sort of simple one to take a look at.
Maybe Will or Jacqueline, if I could ask one of you to just put the a link to that book again. So it was, say it again, it's the
Presentation Lab, and it's Simon Morton, Morton.
Very good. Very good. It's also interesting because this goes back to it. Steve, the thing that's funny about this is, and I didn't ever mention this, but my backstory is I founded a conversation intelligence company called Exec Vision, which was, and by the way, here are your poll results. Here are your poll results.
Okay. Oh, that's an interesting split.
Yeah,
that's more even than I was expecting, actually. So
a
very
lot more
interesting.
than I was expecting. Mhm.
I'd be interested to take a look at a few of those as well and see how robust they are. But that's great if that's where they're at. That's really good.
So I founded my company, sold it to MediaFly in 2022.
Mm.
And when I did, I had been exposed to the basics of ROI within a sales model, sales process before, but nothing like what I was then exposed to. I didn't really understand the true value story and everything. And the more I've learned about it, the more I've talked to our customers, listened to our calls with our customers when we do our executive business reviews, the more I realize it seems like it fundamentally comes down to people and the change management that happens. And this is speaking to what David mentioned in I think a very good comment. He said we need our salespeople to have the courage and ability to identify where they need to invest in a value selling approach and where it's better or safer to stay in a transactional level because the client simply won't raise to a different, more strategic engagement level. Then the selling and differentiation approach and skill set is different. And I think that's really well said because there are going to be opportunities. Even our best customers at MediaFly, they do not achieve 100% usage and adoption of like a business value assessment. Like there are certainly going to be examples of deals where you're not going to have one for any particular number of reasons. But I think the key here is the courage to do it, because the reality is that the skills with the people are lacking to, number one, have some confidence that by asking these questions, you're not putting off your customer or your prospect. I think a lot of salespeople think by asking about deeper business reasons and getting into the quantitative case that this is going to offend the buyer or maybe embarrass the buyer, because the truth is a lot of times the buyer doesn't have these numbers or calculations.
Yeah.
So then it does give them a little bit more work to do. But as our own CRO says, slow down and go fast. If we do that then and we put a pin in it, we say, hey, let's just put a benchmark on that number right there. Let's pin that right there, but then come back with whatever your number looks like. And when they are able to go and fetch that and bring it back, it makes it even stronger. And it puts us on the same side of the table. But the thing that I find the most interesting about this is there's Gartner research where they asked buyers, what type of content do you want from the seller? So if the seller can provide you any type of content, what would be number one? Number one is support and building a business case. That was number one. Number two, which was the second closest, which was like 7 percentage points lower, was a demo. So our buyers are telling us, I would rather have you help me build a business case than have you give me a demo. But I think it speaks exactly to what's on the slide, because guess what we love to do? We love to be the Bentleys and show up and look nice and pretty, and be polished. We love to have that presentation, have that cool kind of edge. We focus a lot on that as a business. And then later on, what does that downstream proposal look like for all the other members of the buyer group that we're never going to meet? We're never going to meet these people.
But I think there's also a key point in what David's saying about sales need to have the courage to do it. But you can use process partly to give salespeople courage. And so one of the things to think about is what within the sales process, is there a way in which a seller can look at a deal and evaluate it and actually have a score that says, this is the one. This is the one that is worth me spending the time and energy and pulling that team in on. Because if you haven't got, and with a lot of customers, we work on a thing called an opportunity win plan that actually breaks down what's the size of deal, chances of winning, where am I at, what do I need to do in order to win it. But if you can start to put some scores and some metrics against that deal, that's where you draw your courage from. Because it's like, actually, I'm all in on this. This is the right size, the right shape. I'm in the right position. So we don't just expect sales to have that courage. We can actually equip them to be brave, I think, is the thing that I would sort of urge people to think about. Does the process support them in the decision-making process of which deals to do it for?
And look at Keith's comment. He said, we're adamant about it. And even if the champion or coach is resistant or reluctant to participate, 80 to 90% of the time, you get to that economic buyer, that CFO, and it's in the 11th hour and they have no idea why they're being asked to spend money. and they're asking for a business case. So I think the other thing too is it's maybe not just the reluctance or the fear factor that exists for our own sellers and our companies. It's also for our champion buyers, because a lot of times they get twisted up with this stuff. I also hear a lot of times they'll know the inputs, they'll help you with the KPIs, but then they'll say things like, I really appreciate if you don't mention that I told you this. There's a fear,
Yes.
there's a fear factor that they're giving us something that they're not supposed to be sharing with us. But here we go. When we get to the economic buyer is like, yeah, you have to have a business case.
Yeah.
Where is it?
Yeah.
You know,
And our job is to help people buy. So we have to navigate through those complexities with them. Our job isn't just to keep pushing solutions at people. So if we're taking them on the journey, if they feel supported, they'll share that information. If they're clear it's not risky for them, they'll share the information. So we have to create that comfort zone for people, which means, again, not hitting them too soon with it, finding the right way, the right time. That's why I love selling. It's not easy, but you've got to read the individuals, the circumstances, and guide people. That's our job.
and shameless plug in the MediaFly side, as we're the ones providing the software that powers a lot of business value assessments. I think for a lot of people on this call as well, is we continue to hear that trend. There's two trends I find that are really hot right now. One is buyer and seller self-service. So designing your value tools in such a way that it's click through, buyers and sellers are on the same side of the table. It is something that is manageable by a mere mortal and not a value engineer, when you don't have one that can be participating in that particular deal, especially if you go in the mid-market. The second big trend that we're seeing is connecting the upfront. We've been talking about business value assessments and sales, but connecting that with the downstream customer success value realization, so that we have the whole continuation of value of that value story for that particular customer. That's incredibly powerful, especially as you look at a lot of the revenue these days, as we've seen the slowdown in new business and new logo sales. A lot of the revenue comes from growth of existing customer accounts, going wider and deeper in existing customer accounts. So if you have that value realization calculation as well, it makes a huge difference if you can get the next $250,000.
And don't even get me started on customer success plans, because that's a whole nother area that we need to be pulling that from post-sale into the sales process. It's a massive opportunity because you're selling that future value. So at the moment, I still see too much of a gap between sales and customer success, but that's probably a whole another webinar for another
Different
day.
webinar, right? Yeah. I mean, the last point on that is quite literally, I'm seeing that the value cases for sales and for CS are owned by even completely different parties, which is, I mean, how could you ever have one constant thread like that? That's nuts. So everyone, thank you so much for all of this. This is your engagement's been fantastic. So Steve, I might believe that you're providing an offer for the folks here today listening.
Yeah, absolutely. So happy to, having sort of talked about the importance of storytelling, the importance of this quality of your presentation, quality of your proposal. More than happy, in terms of for anybody out there who wants to send us an example of how they're doing it. If they just want a fresh set of eyes, we can audit presentations, we can audit proposals to give, I guess, blunt feedback in the way that we will view your document or your proposal or your presentation in the way your end customer does. And either it works and we get it, or actually we'll see some holes in it. So if anybody wants to take us up on that, we can obviously put NDAs in place beforehand, but happy to take a look through and run a sort of detailed analysis and give people feedback so they know, whether they're nailing it or where they can make improvements. So be delighted to support MediaFly and do that if people think it's of interest.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. On our side at MediaFly, a couple things we can do, like Gary had mentioned. Can you show some examples of how different companies use KPIs to illustrate different ROI or benefits calculations? The answer is yes. Just get in touch with us one-off. We're happy to do that. And then secondly is recently we've brought to market Tool Builder. One of the pieces of feedback we got is we don't want to be able we don't want to have to come back to you every time we want to spin up a different tool for industry vertical or market segment, et cetera. We want a platform that we can build our own tools in a way that doesn't require anybody to write code. So happy to share that with you and show you how some companies are taking advantage of that today to overall reduce the cost of all the business cases that they're getting out there into the market. So with that, I'll see if there are any other questions, comments. Otherwise, we appreciate your time, everyone. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Steve.